Steady, are you ready?
What's up? It's Skratch Bastid here for Skratch School. How you doing? Thank you for all your great feedback on the survey over on skratchschool.com. One of the main things that we heard back from you is that you're having trouble with needle skipping. Now this is one of those things that happens to all DJs, so I figure one of the first topics that we should cover is needle skipping. And I'm going to go through it with 5 easy steps that I call
5 tips to no skips.
Now the very first thing that you have to do, let's get this out of the way, you need a solid table. If you don't have a solid foundation, you're going to have all kinds of vibrations and wiggles that are going to be causing you troubles all over the place. So find yourself a solid table, whether that's at home in your studio, get a good solid one built, or buy a nice solid one, or at a gig, just make sure you've got nice insulation around the legs and that it's not shaking. Along with a solid table, you're going to need a good working turntable. Now that means the parts around here haven't been bumped or damaged or need fixing. You need something that is really going to be steady and solid, like a 40-pound turntable typically is. Once we've got that steady base, let's look at some of the different factors that influence skipping with a record. The first thing I tell people is to make sure that your anti-skating is at 0. Now let's talk about what anti-skating is. Anti-skating is a small force that pushes back out towards the record to stop the needle from skating, which is moving towards the center of the record. Now, we want to get rid of that because the primary rule for avoiding skips is to make sure there's no forces going left or right. That is, like a solid table will prevent that from going left or right or vibrations. And anti-skating is a more acute but very important thing to leave at 0 in my experience, because you don't want those forces turning back. Your needle is going to skip over those grooves and move back towards the outside of the record. We don't want that. So let's just adjust that to 0. Should be there already. The next thing that we've got to check for is the calibration of the needle. Now every needle is different and it depends which ones you like, but in my experience I like Shure M447 needles. I've done a tutorial video on the M447s, but I might as well update one with a new beard, so be on the lookout for that. But if you want to check my old YouTube, you can find something about the general setup and calibration of the needle. But let's talk about it briefly. You want to set your tone arm to a balance of 0, so that's kind of floating, and then add, what I find, 2.5 grams of tracking force to the tone arm. Now this is not a lot, but I find if you have too much weight on the needle, it's going to be shifting side and side, succumbing to the weight that you put on it. So you don't want too much on it, because if you take out all the other external forces, it's just going to be moving back and forth in the groove. It doesn't really need a whole lot to stay down if you're handling it correctly. Now every turntable and every DJ is a little bit different, so play around with that force, just finding where it's responding to your control the way you need it to. We want to keep an eye on the needle and the cartridge, the piece of plastic that holds the needle in place, and make sure it's not moving too far side to side. If it is, and if it looks like it's heavy, you might want to put less tracking. If it's kind of light and bouncing, you might want to add a little bit more tracking. Now let's talk about your hand on the record, which is what scratching actually comes from. Very important part of the puzzle. Scratching can be sort of like a strong sound, and sometimes we feel like we've got to really lean into it and flex, but it's all about actually having a light touch. Sometimes I get excited and go a little faster, but at the end of the day, the hand that's on the record is actually quite light on the record. When we touch the record with our hand, we want to make sure that it's light, not too heavy so that it's slowing down the platter, and not too hard so that it's making the needle potentially jump from groove to groove. You want to grip the record just light enough that you have control over it and can move it back and forth to scratch, but not so much that it's slowing down the platter or, even worse, creating vibrations when you're tapping on it that will cause the needle to bounce back or forward grooves. You want to keep it steady and touch it lightly so that it's not disrupted by your hand touching the record. You can move it fast, but still have a light touch. After all those things, it's important to remember every record is pressed a little bit differently. Records are physical things that were pressed, and so each one of them is unique. These have many different factors. Some of the different factors are singles, or 12 inches, have wider grooves because they only have a few songs, as opposed to an album from your parents' collection or something like that, which has closer, smaller grooves, making it easier to skip over to the next one, compared to a single, which has wider grooves, which makes it harder for the needle to skip a further distance over to the next groove. That can actually help the needle stay in place. So singles or 12 inches are actually easier to scratch with than, say, Led Zeppelin 4. You also have to be aware of records that are pressed kind of bold or oval shaped. Some records that are shaped kind of like a soup bowl will naturally be wobbly because they're, it's kind of like cupped, I call it. So you should check your records before you buy them to make sure that that they're not like that, because one side will be very spinny, like whew, and the other side will almost be like a suction cup that will hardly backspin. So especially with Serato and digital vinyl control records, you want to make sure that the ones that you choose are as flat as can be, because you're going to be using them a lot, and if they're cupped or bowled, that's going to cause you headaches down the road. Besides the grooves, we also have to remember that every record has a hole in the middle. This is something people forget a lot, but that hole typically has a little bit of a gap. And if you're going to be scratching with that record, you want to fill it in so that it's not creating side-to-side vibrations that would cause the needle to skip. Back in the day, DJs used to use Kleenex to make sure that that was kind of insulated. I don't like to keep a box of Kleenex around the turntables, so when I have my records, I like to find a small sliver of a sticker to fill in those gaps. Now when you fill it in, you want to make sure that it's not too tight that the record is sticking to the spindle, the middle pin in the turntable, or else that's going to cause more vibration. But you want to make sure that it's tight enough that it's not wobbling back and forth, creating external forces left and right on the needle. Records come in all shapes and sizes, and these 7 inches, or 45s, are even harder to scratch because your big hand takes up more space, potentially causing more vibration on these little guys. And the big hole in the middle is even less predictable than these small holes on the 12 inches. So these take a little bit of extra care, so if you see a DJ using these, give him a handshake. Start with a solid foundation. You need a good table and good turntables. From there, set your anti-skating at 0, so there's no external left and right forces. You're going to have, for sure M447s, a tracking force of about 2.5 grams on the tone arm weight. Now, that could be a bit different for yours, but find your comfort zone there, where it's not too heavy and not too light. Then we're going to have a light touch on the record that moves back and forth, again causing no external forces left or right, back and forth, instead of... And don't forget that every record is different, so practice and get comfortable with your favorite records to make sure they're the right ones for you to use when you're rocking the house. This is Skratch Bastid signing off for Skratch School. Make sure you head over to skratchschool.com and sign up, give us some feedback in the survey, and be on the lookout for new videos. Peace.
Skratch Bastid.